students, and welcome to lesson number 11. This is our last formal lesson, so the last lesson where you will get theoretical content. The last lesson, lesson number 12, which will consist of a number of book recommendations that I have for you on literature about this topic of architecture, history, and theory, with a focus on embodiment. So I just wanted to tell you as a teaser, and the focus of today's class is about the development of the theories of the embodied mind, and also continuing what we already started in the last lesson, and focusing a little bit more on the theory of emotion, biological explanations on the root of emotion, and how these theories, influenced by the developments in neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive sciences, how they are reshaping the way we think about architectural space, and so how architecture history and theory is also changing due to the influence of these new theories and these new perspectives on architecture. So, embodiment. According to Stanford Encyclopedia, embodiment means that an agent's cognition is dependent upon its physical characteristics, meaning its body or corporeal properties. These include its physical arrangement, as well as its sensory system, which are understood as a whole sentient entity. The concept of embodiment implies that such properties play a significant role in an agent's cognitive processing or reading of the environment. By cognition, in Latin cogito, to think, we refer to the term that defines the mental processes that are involved in gaining knowledge and understanding. As example of cognitive activities that are higher level functions of the brain, we can refer to internal actions or movements such as thinking, knowing, remembering, judging, and problem solving, keeping in mind that they are responsible for perception, imagination, language, and planning. Contemporary science, specifically with the work of authors such as Varela and Damasio, acknowledges that the body of an agent, in this case, for example, our human body, but it could also be an animal or a less complex organism. The body of an agent operates on three distinct cognitive levels. The body can operate as a constraint on condition, meaning that it can restrict the system, as a distributor for cognitive processing, meaning that it can extend cognition, and as a regulator of cognitive activity, meaning that it can support the processes needed for the system's homeostasis. What is homeostasis, now you ask? So, homeostasis is a concept that was, for example, presented by the neuroscientist Damasio, and it expresses the notion of the process that maintains the stability of the human body's internal workings in response to changes in its surrounding environment, being a property that assures that the different variables responsible for keeping the system or the body agent balanced are regulated, keeping internal conditions stable and relatively constant while responding to changes in the external environment. So this sounds a little bit difficult as a definition at first, but basically homeostasis is this very complex process of internal mechanisms that are responsible to keep, in our case of humans, to keep the human body in a state of balance. And this happens because we are constantly embedded, we are constantly immersed by the environment. And it's in this interaction between the body and the environment that the process of homeostasis unfolds, and it unfolds to make sure our survival in the environment and to make sure that we are balanced enough to keep living. So the cognitive linguist George Lakoff, author of the influential book Metaphors We Live By, argues that all cognition is based on knowledge that comes from the body, and that other domains are mapped onto our embodied knowledge using a combination of conceptual metaphors, image schemas, and prototypes. Researchers like Lakoff have developed work that suggests that humans use their understanding of known physical objects, actions, and situations, which include architectural and urban spaces, to understand other more complex domains. Examples of these domains are more disciplines such as mathematics, but also general emotional processes such as social relationships and death. The contemporary understanding of the term embodied mind, therefore, refers to the intrinsic unity that exists between a body's various sensory-motor capacities and cognition, regarding that such sensory-motor capacities are themselves embedded in an integral wider context that includes biological, psychological, and cultural aspects. As we already discussed in the previous lessons, the interest on the topic of the emotional experience of architectural space has reappeared in the last years, especially in the field of architecture through the work of authors such as Juhani Palasma, who we already mentioned many times before, as a consequence of the influence of the embodied mind theory on diverse areas of knowledge. In cognitive sciences, research exploring the use of digital technologies in sensory design has been applied as an approach to various issues, for example, supporting the assisted living of Alzheimer patients. And in this framework, we have examples of what we call sensorial design. And by sensorial design, we are referring to the contemporary approach to design as experience, and it is a blooming area of practice and research. Sensory design includes the calculated choice and arrangement of design elements, taking in consideration the psychophysiological effect of parameters such as color, light, scent, and sound on the human body. Sensory design spaces usually are conceived around a specific narrative and are generally chosen for the customization of environments in which the physical experience of space plays an important part. Examples of its use in architectural settings include healthcare facilities such as hospitals, spas, and wellness centers, large retail areas such as shopping centers or cultural venues, entertainment areas such as museums, cinemas, but also in theme parks. It is important to refer that sensorial design, in contemporary terms, usually relies on the use of the latest technology and is nowadays intrinsically connected to new media, being augmented reality installations, one of the most common examples of its application. Therefore, it is also common that such environments are designed in collaboration of architects but also information technology specialists, although it is also frequent that such projects are developed with marketing specialists as well. Laboratory experiments undertaken in the field of sensory design, which have used augmented reality and emotion measurement methodologies to assess the user sensory experience of specific architectural settings, have demonstrated that these methodologies can be very helpful to understand how design solutions are perceived by the users, for example, patients with specific health conditions. Although such methodologies definitely offer architectural practice many advantages because they start to inform design about scientific parameters we were not aware to before. There still is a certain resistance from the architectural community to accept an involvement with such methodologies that apply the knowledge coming from neurosciences and cognitive sciences. And so this is really a new field. Still, we have to recall that until the 19th century, some of the most important developments in the field of architecture, both in theory and in practice, as we have seen in the review we have been doing through these lessons, have taken place through the work of authors who are directly involved with other areas of knowledge, such as psychology and even medicine, as we had, for example, in the case of Claude Perrault, who had studied medicine before being an architect, and of course, not even mentioning in the Renaissance Alberti, Leonardo da Vinci, who were directly involved also in technological development. Although it may seem that the topic of emotions and the sensory experience of architecture might be a new source of concern for the architectural community, as we already had discussed in the previous lessons, they were already addressed in the 19th century by Heinrich Wölfflin, especially in his work Prolegomena for a Psychology of Architecture. We discussed this in lesson number 7. Interestingly enough, essays such as Wölfflin were produced in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, at the time when technological developments caused social and economic changes that led to a paradigm shift in the culture. A similar process can be observed now in contemporary culture since the proposal of the Embodied Mind theory by Varela in 1992 and its rippling effects in many areas of knowledge, ranging from social sciences to marketing or economics. New terms have since then been established, such as neuromarketing, neuroeconomics, and even neuroarchitecture, although still an emerging area of research. Wölfflin's work is part of a collection of essays called Empathy, Form and Space, Problems in German Aesthetics, 1873 to 1893. And this was translated from German into English by Harry Francis Malgrave, who we already mentioned before, only in 1994. This may explain why the topics of empathy, emotions, and architecture have remained a rather hidden concern that stayed in the German-speaking intellectual landscape for quite a long time. So you in Germany actually have a privilege to have had the access to these theories of empathy long before the rest of the world, because they generated in Germany, they were preserved in the German language, and although they are from the 19th century, it was only in 1994, so almost at the end of the 20th century, that they were translated into English and started to circulate in the world and in the architectural community. The translator of these theories, Malgrave, also is, not surprisingly, one of the founding members of ENFA, the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, and is the author of the book Architecture and Embodiment from 2014. It's this book here, Architecture and Embodiment, the Implications of the New Sciences and Humanities for Design. And we will talk about this book in the last lesson. I will make some recommendations, some book recommendations, and this is one of them. In this book, Architecture and Embodiment, Malgrave writes concisely but with precision on the implications of contemporary knowledge on the relation of body and mind, and how such knowledge can help us to better understand the role of architecture in human emotions and vice versa. Malgrave is also one of the main reviewers of other important architectural publications, and is also an accomplished, besides being a theoretician, is also an accomplished practicing architect. Already in the late 19th century Germany, as we learned from Mulgrave, answers to the aesthetic problem of how we might appreciate and explore architectural space, as well as other aesthetical manifestations, have been proposed but not verified within what was in the 19th century the positivist definition of science. This was due to the unavailability of methodologies that measured emotion. This has caused discussions on architecture and emotions to remain silent and confined to the aesthetical field and to phenomenological studies. The progressive specialization and establishment of architecture as an area of knowledge in itself may have also contributed to disregard the evolution of such methodologies or even the importance of emotional experience of architectural space. Such concepts would even be deemed as ridiculous or disregarded as romantic idealizations that had more in common with the Beaux-Arts tradition than with the functionalists' approach brought by the early 19th century's avant-garde, that regardless of many postmodern efforts to desacralize it, remains established in the referential pantheon of modern architecture titans. Still, we must recall Le Corbusier's concern with this topic when he states that construction is made to hold things together, architecture is for stirring emotion. Now we go a little bit more into biology and to understand through this biological perspective how can we define emotions, and then we will proceed to apply this biological definition of emotion in the context of architecture and of course architecture history and theory and the foundation of a new theory of aesthetics. So emotions are not easy to define or classify, and one has to consider the etymology, so the origin of the word. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the modern meaning of emotion is surprisingly recent and very different from its original sense. In the 16th century, the word first meant a public disturbance or commotion, the root of the word coming from the Latin movere, which means to move, and the second sense represented a movement or a migration. The main current meaning of emotion as a strong feeling, for example as joy or anger, was not used in writing until the early 1800s. It wouldn't take too long until emotions were examined with greater rigor in the scientific field, first in biology with Charles Darwin, and later in psychology with Freud, Lipps, and Jung. Nowadays, and here we take again Damasio's work as a reference, a scientific definition of emotion consists of physiological changes, cognition, behavior and feelings which occur in the body of an agent as an effect of the particular context environment in which she or he is embedded in. The biological purpose of emotions is to inform the agent about their interaction with the world. The core aspects of emotions reside in their expression, which is done in great part, but not only, through facial communication and in their recognition. In 1872, Darwin had already defined in his book The Expression of Emotions in Men and Animals what could be called a lexicon of basic emotions, including anxiety and fear, sadness, anger, happiness and joy, and disgust, among others. These emotions are basic in the sense that they are biologically grounded and important to the evolutionary survival of the individual. After Darwin, this lexicon was extended and refined. In 1962, Robert Plutchik, for example, created a wheel of emotions consisting of 8 basic emotions and 8 advanced ones, in which each advanced emotion was composed of two basic ones. Plutchik's wheel relates colors to emotions and seems to have drawn inspiration from some of Eaton's notions on color and gestalt, although in a simplification. It's also reminiscent of Goethe's theory of color. So here you have an example of Plutchik's wheel of emotions, which you will get by Moodle in the image material to accompany the text. It's figure 11.1. According to this wheel system, which of course we can apply in architectural design, but according to this wheel system, primary emotions, like primary colors, can be expressed with different intensities and mixed with each other to form additional emotions. The wheel includes 8 primary bipolar emotions, namely joy versus sadness, anger versus fear, trust versus disgust, and surprise versus anticipation. The socially constructed and self-conscious or self-reference emotions are pride, shy, embarrassment, guilt, and shame. Some of these emotions, in addition to provide information about the individual, function as mechanisms of social control. In human beings, emotional behavior has been studied mainly in relation to facial expression. The expressions for the various emotions seem to be universal, although rules for when and how much emotion to express vary from culture to culture. Physiological arousal is thought to be a necessary aspect of emotion, but this has not been proved so far. Both the autonomic and the central nervous systems are implicated in emotion, but there is scarce evidence to support the idea that each emotion has its own particular pattern of physiological expression, because it also depends from individual to individual. The major form of cognition involved in emotion is the appraisal of the significance of stimuli by the individual. So what for me I might experience as something that makes me angry, for another person might be something that is funny and that might even be enjoyable. For example, I'll give a personal example, the example of theme parks. Many people have a great time when they go to theme parks. They have fun being restricted by these machines that move them and make them have these really, really strong sensations. I personally have a horrific detestation for theme parks. I had them before, I visited them only when I read about them, and I did experience when I traveled in the United States. I did visit one theme park, which I thought would not be too bad, and although I do admit that what is done there is very cleverly done, in the sense that it really creates very specific atmospheres very effectively, so it is clever, but it's absolutely horrifying, and I absolutely detest it. But that is my personal experience, and I could see that many people who were visiting were having a great time enjoying those experiences, but it's just simply not for me. So this is one example, and of course I could elaborate and explain why and try to convince everybody why I think my perspective, why I think theme parks are not only destructive of communities, but they're also absolutely destructive of human beings' capacity to experience joy in wonderful and beautiful things, because they condition them to have these sensation-seeking, extremely strong emotional experiences, and in my opinion, this leads to a general feeling of numbness and not being able to enjoy anything else. But this is a parallel. So emotion and cognition are intimately intertwined, and emotion and motivation are also connected. It is difficult to understand emotion without considering cognition. The main way in which cognitions and emotions are linked is through appraisal. So appraisal is our judgment on something, how we judge something. When anything happens, we evaluate what it means for us, its significance to us. This is an emotional appraisal. or an appraisal that leads to an emotional reaction. These appraisals are believed to help us in making fine distinctions about our emotional experiences or in determining the extent or the intensity of the emotion. So for a very simple schema of the thinking process, we have here this loop, and we can see that it starts with emotion, thought. I'm sorry, this is sliding. Emotion, thought, behavior, physiological arousal. So we can see it's a very simplified model of the thinking process, but it's one way to understand a little bit the correlation between these things. And you will also get this diagram and schema of the thinking process, and it's figure 11.2. Since the 1970s, there is a great variety of affective report measures available, and this is used in fields of knowledge besides architecture, and they include psychology, cognitive sciences, and human-computer interaction. This has raised difficulties in defining to what access when measuring people's reports of how they feel, of their internal feeling states. According to Lang, choosing a physiological or behavioral measure can be surprisingly easy to the extent that available technology and methodological procedures determine the choice most of the time. Emotional response, in fact, to anything, to a painting, to a situation, or to an architectural space, to a building, even to a city, can be measured, considered at least 3 different systems: affective reports, physiological reactivity, and behavioral acts, so how we behave, how we act. To Bradley and Lang, the differences in affective meaning among stimuli, such as people, objects, places, or events, can be summarized using 3 basic parameters. Such parameters have been coined by Wundt, who we talked about before, who defined them originally as Lust, or pleasure, Spannung, tension, and Beruhigung, inhibition. Later on, these parameters were settled as pleasure, arousal, and dominance, respectively. It is interesting to note that Wundt's work is repeatedly mentioned in Wolflin's Prolegomena for a Psychology of Architecture. So already in the end of the 19th century, when Wolflin wrote the Prolegomena for a Psychology of Architecture, trying to understand how architecture influences our emotions and influences our experience, already there was this notion that we, while experiencing space, would probably be doing this kind of appraisal. Wundt's theoretical categories have been consistently used since his contribution to the field of psychology, and according to Bradley and Lang, empirical work in the field has confirmed consistently that the parameters of pleasure, arousal, and dominance are pervasive in organizing human judgments for a varied range of perceptual and symbolic stimuli. Judgments of nonverbal stimuli, such as sonar signal and aesthetic pieces of art, have often been measured using the semantic differential scale developed by Osgood and others, and by Mehrabian and Russell. So these are other researchers who have developed similar ways to measure emotion. So to give you an idea or an overview, not that you would have to memorize these categories, don't be worried, oh, I have to memorize these terms from psychology to understand all the parameters through which we can analyze an architectural space. No, kind of panic. You don't have to, but I find that it's interesting and important for you to understand that this is a way that you can learn also to look at architecture and to understand the experience of architecture through this perspective. So, for example, this scale, the semantic differential scale, it's another way to measure emotions, and that can be applied in architecture. This scale is largely used to assess the human perception of three-dimensional structure of objects, events, and situations. It consists of 18 bipolar adjective pairs, each rated along a 9-point scale. The analysis of the resulting ratings in the 18 parameters generates scores in the dimensions of pleasure, arousal, and dominance, according to Wundt's categories. The 18 pairs are unhappy, happy, annoyed, pleased, unsatisfied, satisfied, melancholic, contented, despairing, hopeful, bored, relaxed, relaxed, stimulated, calm, excited, sluggish, frenzied, dull, jittery, sleepy, wide awake, unaroused, aroused, controlled, controlling, influenced, influential, cared for, in control, odd, important, submissive or dominant, and guided or autonomous. As said above or before, these pairs are evaluated usually on a 1 to 9 rating scale for the three Wundt parameters of pleasure, arousal, and dominance. According to Bradley and Lang, although the semantic differential scale is shown to be informative of the perceiver's emotional response to the exposure of certain stimuli, there are a number of difficulties that can be related to its use. The first of these difficulties lie on the fact that it's not practical to come up with 18 different ratings for each stimulus presented during an experiment. So this is the reason why we don't use it also in the appraisal of an architectural building, because it's too many parameters and they would have to be rated from 1 to 9. But in any case, you can see how an experience of a building theoretically could be evaluated in very specific terms. But there's other tools and there's other things that, for example, we can use. And I will tell you about another tool that can be used. And this actually I have used myself in my own research. I develop research in this field of theory and practice of design, and I use these methodologies and I make experiments to evaluate the effect of design objects, to evaluate the emotional experience of users when performing with prototypes of design objects by using this kind of methodology. So this is another example for you. So another system that can be used for evaluation was devised by Lang, Holtz, and Cook, and it's an image-based instrument which is called the Self-Assessment Mannequin, or SAM. SAM consists in a graphical representation of different emotional states organized into the same three categories established by Wundt, that is intended to directly assess the response of a subject to an object or an event. Initially, SAM was implemented as an interactive computer program, but since this version wasn't flexible enough and required both the knowledge of the technology, at least on a basic level, it was adapted to a paper and pencil simple version that illustrates in a graphic way various points along each of the three major affective dimensions. So, valence, activation, and control. Bradley and Lang's SAM chart uses graphic scales that range from a smiling, happy figure to a frowning, unhappy one in the pleasure parameter, and from an excited, wide-eyed figure to a relaxed, sleeping one in the arousal parameter. The dominance parameter represents changes in the feelings of control, and it is rated through variations in the size of the SAM mannequin. A small figure indicates minimum control, and a large figure indicates maximum control of the situation. In this paper and pen version, subjects in the experiment can place their choice by placing a cross over any of the 5 figures or between any 2 of them. Subjects can also make a circle around the 9-point rating scale for each parameter. This is an explanation of how SAM works, and you see that it was based on this, roughly based on these parameters defined by Wundt. And curiously enough, it has not been. It is largely applied in the field of ergonomics, and I am at the moment also teaching ergonomics, and I am interested in neuroergonomics, where SAM is actually widely used to evaluate the response of individuals to certain conditions. And of course, this has a connection to architecture, because architecture also deals with ergonomics. But we as architects normally don't use these tools, although of course they have benefits. So for you to see an example of how SAM, the self-assessment mannequin chart, looks like, please take a look at figure 11.3. You have here an example of SAM, as I described before, for the parameters of valence, activation, and control. SAM has been widely used with very reliable results to measure emotional responses in a variety of experimental settings, including reactions to pictures, images, sounds, advertisements, painful stimuli, among others. SAM has also been used with children, anxiety patients, and other clinical populations for their assessment of particular experiences. Therefore, SAM has been widely accepted by the scientific community as an easy, non-verbal, and reliable method for quickly assessing people's reports on affective experiences. Affective, not effective. Affective means from affect, from how we feel towards something. How we, not how we feel, but how we emotionally bond to something, how we emotionally connect to something. So to my knowledge, besides the experiments which I have done myself in my own field of research, SAM is not widely used in the field of architecture, with some rare exceptions. There seems to be no empirical final solution to the debate on which components are sufficient or necessary to measure emotions either. So SAM is one example, but this is a completely open field, and it's also a very new field, and people are still trying out many other possibilities of figuring out how to measure emotion. However, since the late 90s of the 20th century, and specifically with the rapid development in the area of human-computer interaction systems, emotions and human experience have been taken in consideration as more important factors specifically to determine interface design solutions. Desmet treated emotion as a multifaceted phenomenon consisting of the following components: behavioral reactions, expressive reactions, physiological reactions, and subjective feelings. Such definition of emotion illustrates the breadth of the phenomenon and reflects the complexity of emotions as responses, including many of these elements. Mauss and Robinson divided emotional response into emotional experience, physiology, and behavior, whereas Lang had categorized it into affective evaluation, facial expressiveness, visceral reactivity, and behavioral responses that maintain or terminate stimulation. Such view that considers all facets of emotional response is useful to organize the measurement techniques available to human-computer interaction and established reality. To my knowledge, these concepts and methodologies have not been sufficiently explored in the design process, particularly in the field of architecture. But in industrial or interface design, they are actually for a long time common practice. Donald Norman, a specialist in design, usability engineering, and cognitive science, and he's also the director of the design lab at University of California at San Diego, defines in his seminal work Emotional Design 3 dimensions regarding usability, which differ only slightly from Wundt's parameters, and these are defined as visceral, so relating to the viscera, to our gut feelings, Magengefühle, behavioral, and reflective. Norman claims that emotions shouldn't be disregarded in design, as they have a crucial role in humans' understanding of the environment, taking a very important part also in the learning process, not only in childhood, but also in other stages of life. Nowadays, we are also learning from neurosciences that neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to continue to learn, allows the continued capacity of humans to learn and be creative during the lifetime. So before we thought, we develop our brain until adulthood and then we will experience continuous cognitive decline. This is not true. Our brains have the capacity to constantly learning, lifelong learning, and in fact, this is what we constantly do, since the world is always changing and we are always adapting to the changes of the environment. And of course, this capacity of adapting is a learning process. Norman affirms, based on his research on usability in design, that aesthetically pleasing objects seem to be more effective than purely functional ones because of their sensual appeal. The user feels an affinity or empathy for an object that is appealing to him or her because an emotional bond is established with this object. So Norman gives the example, you can take a look at figure 11.4, gives the example in this book, Emotional Design, of the citrus squeezer designed by Philip Stark, which is of course a design classic, and many people know that in fact it doesn't work very well, but it was an extremely popular design item and commercially very successful because people like it and people identify with it, they find it cool, they find it interesting, and independently of it functioning well or not well, it was successful. So this idea represents a shift from a widely accepted values of performativity, purely based on the target values of efficiency, speed, and cost. Plain usability or function does not account for and does not evaluate the range of emotions linked to human experience. So the human experience is a very complex emotional process, and so it's not enough for us as humans to have something that works well. It has to be beautiful and we have to connect emotionally to it. Although some studies, of course, this idea of beauty is also individual and subjective, and it's also depending on the culture, but this is another discussion. Although some studies on user satisfaction have been conducted, they are limited to the assessment of satisfaction associated with efficiency and error rates. This kind of approach has been regarded as ill-suited to measure emotion. So for example, now I will give you another emotion measurement approach besides the one I mentioned before with the semantic differential scale, and then with SAM, and now with this categorization by Norman of emotional design. Another way to measure emotions, which is nowadays considered more accurate because it addresses the complexity of how we can analyze and measure emotions. And it's called a multi-componential approach, and it was developed by Kim Cho and Tim in 2015. And this approach consists of not just one component to measure emotions, but of a variety of components that provide a comprehensive way of measuring emotion. According to Kim and his colleagues, whose research represents currently the state of the art on emotion measurement, three main components of emotional response are currently accepted in the field of human-computer interaction: experiential response, physiological response, and behavioral response. So the provocative aspect here is that if we see from Norman that we can integrate these practices in the field of usability design, and for example, there are brands such as Apple who definitely use this kind of approach to test their products, and that's why also their products are so successful. So if these methodologies are used in human-computer interaction, why are they not widely used in the field of architecture? We can think about it. Other methodologies or other mechanisms that can, or other technologies that can allow us to understand emotion in real time are emotion measurement methodologies based on biometric markers. And an example of a platform which incorporates biometric markers is on figure 11.5, and this is called the Ehealth Platform. And this is a machine which is used to measure the physiological response of a human body in a determined situation. So you probably maybe some of you already have experienced in a medical context using this kind of biometric machinery. For example, this eHealth platform performs biometric and medical applications where the body can be monitored using 10 different sensors. Pulse, to measure the pulse, the oxygen in the blood, the airflow, body temperature, electrocardiogram, glucometer, galvanic skin response, blood pressure, the subject's position, and the muscle electromyography. And this information can be used to monitor the emotional and physiological state of a human body in real time, and the data on the states can be afterwards analyzed. So this is another. You probably remember when I talked yesterday about the work of Stellark, the performance artist Stellark. Stellark was really pioneered in the field of performance art, because he, as a performance artist who had initially started to study architecture and then went to performance art, he's interested in working with the human body as an architecture in itself. And Stellark was really pioneer in the incorporation of these biometric tools, these tools that we can use and through the technology see in real time how the physiology of the body is reacting in real space. And then we have this data, and we can analyze what is happening in the human body. And of course, such things are also used. Such methodologies are also used in the field of ergonomics, for example, to analyze the performance of a user, and then to analyze the cognitive engagement while performing certain tasks, and also to boost the efficiency in certain actions, or simply to improve the interaction between the person and the system one is interacting with. Of course, this can also be applied in the field of architecture and architectural design, and it is a growing field of knowledge. Other machinery that can also be used, we discussed and we talked about it yesterday, the Fmri, which can be used to monitor in real time to see the human brain at work, and to see what happens, for example, when looking at a painting or when listening to certain music. In the field of architecture, this is still problematic because the limitations of fMRI, for example, in terms of technology, is that they are not portable and the body has to be still. So it's very difficult to, it's not possible to make an assessment of how being, for example, in Berlin, in Hans Scharoun's Berliner Philharmonie, listening to a concert, experiencing the concert while being in this building, it's not possible still to use a machine that can evaluate this experience. But it will probably be possible in the future, because there are a lot of people, a lot of researchers who are working in the development of technologies that can be portable and that can monitor in real time what is happening in the brain when the body moves and experiences a situation with all sorts of stimuli. And this is, of course, very, very exciting in the field of architecture history, in the field of architecture theory, and especially because it's going to dramatically influence how we think about design, how we design, and therefore how we live and how we are going to shape our bodies from the moment we start understanding better how this process works. So, I hope that with all this information I have stimulated your curiosity. Please don't be afraid and don't feel overwhelmed, because I know that a lot of these references come from other disciplines, but this is the 21st century. And in the 21st century, more than ever, architects and interior designers have to be open to work with people from other disciplines and have to be open to learning and to incorporating the knowledge of other disciplines in their own practice. So I hope that this roundup of all these theories of aesthetics was that it has expanded your mind in this field, and that it has also resensitized you for how body and mind are an integrated whole, and how our bodies are medium of experiencing the world, of experiencing architecture, and how we are constantly shaping our environment, and therefore our environment constantly shape us back. And that we do have now the possibility of starting to understand how this process works, and how we can consciously understand it and introduce it and apply it in the design process. So this is the end of the theory. The last lesson will be the next one, and it's not really a lesson, it's more a little bit like a meeting from a book club. And I already showed you one of the books which I will recommend, and I will talk a little bit about. So I will show you roughly about maybe 10 books or 7 books. I still have to decide how many, because I don't want to overwhelm you too much. But I will show you the work of some of these authors I told you about. And I will also talk to you a little bit about, for example, the work developed by the Academy for Neuroscience of Architecture, which is based in San Diego, and to which I am also involved with. I have already presented my work there, because I think it's interesting for you to know that there exists a network of architects who are already working with neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and psychologists and behavioral scientists and people who work with ergonomics and human factors. And so there is really a growing community of people who understand the importance of working together and of bringing together the methodologies from science, from architecture, and from art, so that we can all benefit from the new knowledge and the new possibilities which are opening up now in the 21st century. Hopefully that we can understand how to better shape our human environment and how to live better, more meaningful, and more beautiful lives. So thank you for your attention, and until the next time.